Can you see it? It's good. All right, cool. So for my presentation today, I'll be discussing kind of my thesis on the definition of the act of shaming and going through my reconceptualization of what it means to say when we're shaming someone. So when I started this thesis, for context, I started it in the fall of 2019 through the winter of 2020. And around that time on social media, there's a lot of stuff about cancel culture, and I was kind of going through posts and replies to people and that kind of discussion on cancel culture. And I noticed that there's two kinds of shaming type posts. So one is more of the traditional kind, which was more like, "Hey, I can't believe that you're such like a misogynistic, sexist, racist person. You really shouldn't be existing in society, and as such, please leave." Something like that, which kind of resembles this more traditional definition of shame, which is negative intent and involves the degradation or stigmatization of members in society. However, I also noticed this other type of post that was more, I guess, somewhat positive in manner, and maybe not towards the specific people who were being canceled, but instead like other people who were discussing in the comments section. And part of that was more akin to, I guess, like a hopeful, positive, nurturing sense. And the post would be something like, "Hey, I understand that you have this view. However, it seems that your view is really wrong and it results in a lot of problematic things in society. And as such, there's something wrong with your character. And I hope that you will change for the better and come back to society uh, having understood what you did wrong and promoting more good, so to speak." And in noticing these types of two posts, I kind of came to this understanding that maybe shame doesn't have to involve this degrading stigmatization of members in society as the traditional definition does. Maybe instead there's something more fundamental about shame that needs to be talked about. And some other cases that I kind of thought about and considered when going into the research was uh, what about like this kind of nurturing shaming that a parent might do to their child, i.e., maybe we've seen it before either in media or in real life where there's a child causing a ruckus, being loud, throwing a temper tantrum in public, and the parent kind of has to like bring them aside and say like, "Hey, what are you doing? You're embarrassing the family. You're bringing shame." In this situation, the parent may be shaming the child, but is not really doing so with the intent to degrade or stigmatize the child. The parent's trying to like teach them a lesson and make sure that they understand. Furthermore, again, I've explained the social media posts, but there's also these other types of shaming actions on social media where it's just like, "Wow, I can't believe these type of people exist. Uh, why are they like this?" Which again seems to be some sort of shaming type scenario, but really isn't this like degrading or stigmatization of people that's associated with this traditional definition. So in kind of thinking about these cases and trying to understand them, I wanted to say that shaming doesn't necessarily involve the degradation or stigmatization, but instead involves something, I guess, more general, which I'll get into a bit later. So, to give some context, here's a traditional definition of shame, which is provided by Nussbaum, and I'm just going to go through these four characteristics. So, first, shaming is an act that is dictated by individual or group, condemning or calling out an action performed by another individual or group that violates shared social norms or standards. All that's saying is that shaming is an act done by one person or multiple people to another person or multiple people based on something that they've done that seems to be problematic given social norms or standards. Two, shaming is an act done in public sphere such that society or a third party can witness it. Again, this is something about how shaming is involved with like multiple parties. It's not just group A to group B. There's group C to witness it or a greater collective to witness it. Um, Nussbaum argues that this is because shaming is some sort of societal problem or societal act, whereas instead of a personal act, which for now, let's assume that that's true. Three, shaming is an act directed towards calling out the character of individuals or a group of individuals as opposed to simply their actions. So in this kind of point, Nussbaum is differentiating between guilt tripping and shaming, whereas guilt tripping may be, "Oh, a person or group of people made a mistake, and as such, they deserve to be called out for it and should kind of repent for it, so to speak." Shaming is more with regard to someone's character or something about them as opposed to a simple mistake, and as such, is more serious or meaningful in that regard. And 4, shaming is done to symbolize the ones being shamed as lesser people of society, degrading and stigmatizing their social status. So yeah, this is the main point that I kind of want to push back against, that shaming involves this intent or effect of degrading and stigmatizing these people in society. As such, basically using Nussbaum's definition, I kind of alter the sort of conditions of shaming, and 1, 2, and 3 are mostly the same with some small differences, which I focus on in my paper, but won't be talking about in this presentation. Instead, let me focus on number 4, which is my proposed change about how we ought to view shame, which says shaming is done with the intention of placing a state of shame on another, that is the intention to promote thoughts of self-reflection or introspection. Said differently, shaming is an act in which people call out or call attention to other people who they desire to be changed. So my main point in 4 is kind of changing shame to involve promoting or bringing attention to self-reflection and introspection, as opposed to focusing on like degrading and stigmatizing people. So how do I kind of argue this, and where do I kind of go? So in my research, I kind of went into the literature of the psychological accounts of shame, and kind of developed it from there. So in the psychological accounts of shame, or the experience of shame, they argue that in general, the psychological account of an emotion is split up into these two parts. So the first part is the identificatory belief, which is kind of this realization that comes about that results in an emotion or experience of that emotion. And the other part is the explanatory belief. So where are the thinkings and going ons that are used as evidence to come to that rational conclusion of the identificatory belief. And first, we have Gabrielle Taylor's standard account of shame, which argues that shame occurs when the explanatory beliefs lead to one's identificatory belief that one is defective or degraded, where they now hold a global negative self-assessment about themselves, where by global negative self-assessment, we mean like a negative self-perception of their character. And this seems to resemble, the traditional accounts of shaming that Nussbaum kind of talks about. So what do we mean by this? Let me go through an example. So here we have this example of a standard experience of shame, and I'm just going to go through the kind of thoughts that are going on. So from thought 1 through thought 5 are beliefs that are explanatory beliefs, and then thought 6 is the identificatory belief that kind of realizes this experience of shame. So thought 1, I see myself under some benign, uncritical, unself-conscious description. So maybe, for example, like my thought right now is I'm a good presenter. That's an example of what like a benign, uncritical perception is or description is. Thought 2, I see myself under an alternative description, the detached observer's description. So this is some other party that comes across that says, hey, you're not like what you believe in thought 1. Instead, you're like this. So maybe someone in the comments just says, you're not a good presenter. Presenters shouldn't stumble on their words. Maybe that's something that happens. Then thought 3 is the belief there's a discrepancy between T1 and T2. These are clearly contradicting each other. I'm a good presenter versus I'm not a good presenter. Then we have thought 4. There's a normative standard in accordance with which I find the alternative description and belief T2 to be an undesirable description of myself. So given that T2, I'm not a good presenter, presenters shouldn't stumble on their words. Instead, I say, oh, well, that's something that in society or some sort of social circumstance, I believe that I shouldn't be that instead I should be a good presenter. And leading to T5, I ought not be seen under the alternative description of belief T2, that this is something that I personally don't want to be seen as, that this is something I don't want to associate myself as, which results in the identificatory belief in T6. Therefore, I believe I am defective and degraded. And this is kind of this standard experience of how shame comes about. You see yourself in one way, then this other description comes, and through kind of working through these two descriptions, you realize that you don't want to be what it seems to be, and as such, you're defective and degraded. And according to the standard account, the global negative self-assessment in the identificatory belief is necessary to an experience of shame. However, in the literature, there's also offered Cecilia Munn's non-standard account that kind of goes against this global negative self-assessment and this degrading or defective realization, and instead focuses on an awareness and consideration of another's negative self-assessment towards oneself. So one must have this identificatory belief that someone has a negative self-assessment about one's character. So again, let's go through an example. And in Munn's writing, she talks about an example written about by Adrian Piper, in which in her graduate studies, she identified herself as a Black student on her admissions application. However, when going to conferences, a prominent white male professor believed her to not be Black. That was a fake description of her. And going through these beliefs, so belief one, uh, Piper accurately identified herself as Black on her admissions application. Belief two, a prominent white male professor believed that she fraudulently identified herself as Black because her skin is a bit lighter than quote unquote stereotypical Black, whatever that means. T3, there's a discrepancy between T1 and T2. TP4, there's a shared norm among members of the department, which includes her, that as a graduate student, one should be maintaining worth and authenticity through one's accurate self-presentation. So this shared norm in kind of this social context. TP5, I ought not be seen as fraudulent by a prominent white male professor. Therefore, belief 6, I am marked as wrong in some way. And the difference here is that Piper really doesn't think that the professor's comment is valid or true. It's clear that she's Black despite appearing more white, so to speak. And furthermore, she doesn't really feel this degradation or stigmatization as fraudulent because she doesn't believe it. However, she still feels shame in some way because other people believe that she's fraudulent or wrong in some way, that there's something wrong with her character, and as such still feels shame. As a result, like the non-standard account argues that it doesn't seem right to say that degradation or stigmatization are important to the experience of shame. As such, instead, the identificatory belief involves some sort of reflection about what others think about oneself and whether or not one should take it seriously. And through this, Munn kind of describes these four possible responses that in coming to terms with these explanatory beliefs, one may result in these four kind of identificatory beliefs. One, recognition that one is an aberrant member of one's community. So they kind of identify that there's this description of them that exists within this social context, but they really don't care and they kind of move on with their life. Two is acceptance that one is an aberrant member of one's community. So in this situation, what is happening is, oh yeah, you're right. I am presenting or I am this negative self-assessment, and as such, maybe I ought to change myself. That is the second sort of response. Three is rejection that one is an aberrant member of one's community. So instead they say, oh, well, this description exists, but I just don't believe it. So I really shouldn't care about it in that sense. And four is rejection of the authority in which the claims that one is an aberrant member of one's community is grounded on. So in this situation, instead of rejecting the claim itself, is just rejecting who's saying it. So maybe in this situation, or maybe in a different situation, the description is, oh yeah, you're kind of loud and annoying. And then the response is, well, you really don't know me. You've seen me on one social media post. So how can you even say that about me? Therefore, your authority or what you've said is really not valid and I shouldn't take it seriously. So in this sort of sense, we can reveal that when it comes to the experience of shame, this degradation really isn't necessary. Instead, it's just this awareness of this intent or possibility of degradation, or even just this intent or possibility of seeing someone as problematic or have someone seeing that you have a global negative self-assessment. So turning back to what I'm writing on and moving from the experience or emotion of shame back to the act of shame, as the non-standard account of the emotional experience of shame reveals, more fundamentally is this reflection about another's opinion of oneself and whether or not it is a genuine or meaningful critique. As such, returning to my definition, it seems that the act of shaming can more fundamentally reflect this intent. We shame to get people to reflect on our critique of them in hopes to get them to change. And back to my fourth condition, shaming is done with the intention of placing a state of shame on another, that is, the intention to promote thoughts of self-reflection or introspection. Said differently, shaming is an act in which people call out or call attention to other people who they desire to be changed. Shaming can then be something negative, such as desire for one to change out of anger, but it could also be something more nurturing, such as change or such as desire for one to change out of benevolence or sympathy. So that was a bit short, but that's basically all my comments on that. So thank you for listening.